Hey everyone, my name is Matt. Welcome back. We're going to be hopping back in the time machine this week to take a look at building this walnut coffee table that I made 10 years ago. It features curves on all four sides, and those curves follow through down into the entirety of the table with a drawer with a curved front on both sides. So let's get started. To get started, I went through my stack of walnut and found some boards that I wanted to use for this project. These are stored in my basement, so I just carry these out around to the garage. Once I have all my boards out, I can start laying them out. Here I'm laying out the boards for the subtop. These boards I picked out because they weren't as desirable as some of the other boards. You'll see some of them have a lot of sapwood and just overall aren't that great looking. Now these boards are going to become the top and the shelf. You see I have a nice book match there for the top. And now I can start face jointing all the pieces. The next step is running the boards through the planer. I don't plane to the final thickness at this point. I usually do my milling in a few different stages, just to give the boards time to rest between millings. I had this piece of 8/4 up on my lumber rack, and I'll mark the length and cut them. For the wider one, I can split that one in two and get 2 leg blanks out of it. And then I'll square up one edge at the jointer and then plane them to thickness. So here's the boards for the subtop. And now I'll start ripping them to width to remove any defects and get my panel closer to its final size. The only thing that's going to be seen with this piece are the 2 edges, so I'm not too concerned with what the middle looks like. And then I'll glue and clamp them up. This board's going to give me the shelf. You'll see I cut it in half and then create a slip match with this. After milling them to width, I can join them together. I quick pass over the jointer will true up the edges and give me a nice seamless glue joint. I'll apply a little bit of glue, give the boards a little rub to spread the glue around, and then clamp them up. You can see if your boards are milled up well, you don't need much clamping pressure. Next I can cut the breadboards. I'll rip a piece off of one of the scraps from the top, and then I can joint the breadboards and then rip them to width. Now I can finalize the size of my panels. I'll rip them to width, and then I will stack them on top of each other and cut them to length. I'll also cut the breadboard ends to length. To get started with the breadboard joinery, I'll put a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch groove down the edge of each breadboard. Now I'll cut the shoulders on the breadboards. The breadboards that end up getting the dovetail, those will have shoulders on 3 edges. The one that has tenon will have it on all 4 sides. Next I'll cut the shoulder on the panel. And then with the dado blade, I'll cut a tongue on the end of the panel. Now I can work the tongue in the panel to clean it up and get it fitting into the groove of the breadboard. I'll also clean up the shoulder and get that all flushed up. Here I'm using my router plane just to make sure I'm not skewing the tongue at all, as I am adjusting it with the shoulder plane. Do a little test fit, and that's still too tight, so I'll give it a couple more passes with the shoulder plane, and that's pretty close. Now I can cut the tenons on the end of the panels. And then I'll remove the waste with the coping saw. Now I also need to remove this extra bit on the end. So I'll start cutting that with my dovetail saw until I get to the depth of the spine. And then I'll come back with my flush trim saw and just complete the cut. And then I can clean up that little bit that's left with the chisel. And I can transfer the locations of the tenons onto the breadboard and then cut the mortises at the mortiser. Now my groove is a little wider than 1/4 inch, so there's a little bit of material here to remove after I made the cuts with the mortiser. And that's really easy to clean up with the chisel. Now I can do a little test fit. Still a little tight in the middle, so I'll just hit that with the shoulder plane a couple times and try to fit again. That's much better. Now I can do the other 3. Now to begin cutting the joinery, I'll start by cutting the dovetail on the end of the breadboard for the subtop. A little cleanup work with the chisel. And then I can remove the waste from the other side. Now I need to make a little rabbet on the bottom of the dovetail, just to make alignment with the leg a little easier. So I use my router plane sort of like a marking gauge, just to set my depth, and then I'll come back with my chisel and remove the bulk of the waste. Once I have most of the waste removed, I'll come back with my router plane and clean it up to the final depth. Next I can cut my legs to length. Once I figure out what arrangement I want the legs to be in, I'll mark the tops so I can keep them in order. And this is how I'll transfer the dovetails to the top of the leg. I'll just rest the subtop on top of the legs. There's a nice little recess there from the sit-in. And I can transfer the layout with my marking knife. I'll scribe a line with my marking gauge, set to the thickness of the dovetail. Transfer my lines down, and then I'll go to the drill press to remove most of the waste. And then I can get back to the bench and start chopping out all the waste. Once I have the majority of the waste removed, I can put the leg vertically in my leg vise, and I can pare down the sides right back to my scribe line. And there's the finished socket. Now I can try a little test fit. And that's fitting pretty well. So after doing the other 3 legs, here's what we have. So to get started, I'm cutting the tenons on the end of the breadboard for the shelf. I'll make the cuts to define the sides of the tenons first, and then I'll come back and make the cheek cuts. At the bench, I can use some chisels to do a little cleanup. Now here's how I'm going to transfer the layout from my tenons onto my legs. I cut a small scrap, which is the right offset from the top of the leg, I flush that scrap up with the top of the leg and then lock it into place. I can now make a knife line to indicate where the top of the tenons will be. And then using my marking gauge, I can scribe out a line that will make the side of the breadboard flush with the side of the leg. Now it's really simple just to put the tenons right on top of the leg, push them up against the scrap piece of wood, and then just align them with my scribe line on the right. Once I get everything in place, I can trace around the tenons with my knife. Over at the mortiser, I remove the bulk of the waste from between the lines. And then I'll clean up right to my lines with chisels. Here's a little mistake I made. Always check to make sure your layout is correct the first time. So I cut those in the wrong spot. So I had to cut a little filler to fill those holes, and then I had to cut those mortises again. Now I can glue up the stock for the dividers. And then I can start cutting them to length. To join the dividers to the shelf and the subtop, I'll be using my domino. On similar projects, I've done integral tenons or sliding dovetails here. I drew some indicator lines on the board, and then I can just use my domino to make the mortises. When I'm using this piece of plywood, I make sure I'm always referencing off the same face. So on the table, I have a front, and then on the scrap, I have that marked with the blue piece of chalk, so I know the blue side of the template goes right against the front side of the table. That way I make sure that all my mortises line up correctly. Next I can cut the mortises in the dividers. I'll transfer my layout lines from my plywood template onto the dividers and then cut the mortises with the domino. And then I can try a little test fit. I can try putting the subtop on. I can finally get an idea of what the table is going to look like. Everything seems to be fitting pretty well, so now I can permanently attach the breadboards to the shelf and subtop. For the shelf, I don't want the holes for the pegs to be seen from the top, so I am doing a half blind pinning here. I'm only drilling partially through the board so that the hole is only exposed on one side, which should be the bottom of the table. Next I can make my pegs. I use my dowel plate to do that. With a hand plane, I made a spring joint on the breadboard, and then I use a clamp to pull it together, and I can drill my holes through my tenons of my panels. I need to elongate the holes on the outside of tenons to allow the panel to expand and contract with the seasonal humidity changes. To do that, I'm just using a chainsaw file. Now I can glue the breadboard onto the panel. With the breadboard fully seated and aligned, I can now install the pegs. This is the shelf, so the pegs don't go all the way through, so I just need to stop hammering once the pegs have bottomed out. Once the glue is dried, I can use a flush trim saw to cut the extra length off the pegs. Next I can add the curves to the panels. For the long sides, I used a template that I had already created from a previous project, which worked out great for this. And then I'll use my oscillating belt sander to smooth and ease the curve. Next, with my shop helper, I'll lay out the curves on the breadboards. I'll trace over the pencil line with a pen so that the line is easier to see. With the curve laid out, I can cut that out at the bandsaw. And then clean it up at the sander. Once I have those two curves established, I can transfer them to the other piece. And then I can roughly cut those out at the bandsaw. I can use the first board that I cut the curves on, and I can flush trim the other board to it, using it as a big template. And using the new board as a new template, I can make the curve on the other two sides of the original board. Next, I need to cut the dividers to the right width. Since the subtop and the shelf are now curved, this is going to be at an angle. So I trace the angle on the end of the board, and then I transfer those lines to the face. And I roughly cut them out on the bandsaw and then clean them right up to the line with a hand plane, just to make sure that they are perfectly flush with the subtop and the shelf. And now I can taper the legs. I believe I'm tapering these from the 1 3/4 inch square at the top down to, I think, about 1 inch at the bottom. And after I sanded all the pieces, I can add the last detail before the finish. So now I can start applying the finish. I figured it'd be a lot easier to pre-finish these pieces while they're still flat and not attached to anything than if I had assembled it first. Here I'm using a wiping varnish, General Finishes Armor Seal. This is the semi-gloss. And to finish the legs, I put a little eye hook in the top of them, and then I hang them from the ceiling. For the glue up, I'm using epoxy. I'm also adding a little bit of filler just to make it a little thicker and make it easier to work with. I decided to use epoxy for this glue up mainly because of the open time. If I had used regular wood glue, I would not have been able to get this thing together before the glue set. There's a certain order that the table needs to be assembled in. First, the vertical dividers need to be attached to the shelf. And then the legs need to be attached to that shelf as well. And then the subtop can be attached to the vertical dividers and the legs. Now I don't show it in the video, but I did apply some clamps to this. I clamped across the tenons for the breadboards, also clamped down over the dividers just to make sure those were fully seated. So the next thing I have to do is make my top. I'm using a set of dividers to scribe around the table to give me my offset. I wanted about 1.5 inch overhang on all sides. Now the corners were a little weird since the legs are there, so I used my template for my curve just to kind of finish out the curves to the corners. I do that for both the long curve and the small curve. Doesn't really have to be super precise. I'm just looking to make something that looks like it was meant to be that way. Now the next thing I can do is cut out those curves. And then I'll flush up to the line. I used a hand plane to do that. I first flushed the end grain, and then I flushed the long grain on the sides. Just to give a nice sweeping curve. I didn't want any flat spots or any kind of weirdness to the curve. This actually went pretty quickly, and it was a lot of fun. Now after I sanded the top, I found that it wasn't that great looking. It was very muddy and cloudy and not very clear. So I went over the whole piece with a card scraper, and that really brought out the grain and just added so much more clarity to the piece. I can start finishing the top. After I wiped it down with some mineral spirits to get rid of all the dust, I went ahead and I started applying my first coat of finish. Next I can begin working on the drawers. I milled the stock for the drawer front. This was a little bit of a thicker piece. I think it was 6/4. So once they get that milled up and I get the drawer fronts cut to size, I can start working on the dovetails for my drawer sides. I'm doing that at the bandsaw with just a simple wedge. This makes it really easy and it gives you a very symmetrical pattern to your dovetails because you're flipping them from side to side. And then for the second cut, I want some thin pins. So I line up the blades to go into the curve of the other cut, just making sure that I have enough space there so I don't nick the corner of the adjacent tail. And while I'm at the bandsaw, I'll just cut off the little ends to save me some time at the bench. Now at the bench, I can begin chopping to remove the waste. After I've chopped out most of the waste, staying away from the line, I'll come back with a wider chisel and just make my knife line a little bit deeper. That just makes it really easy to register these thinner chisels into that knife line without them skewing. And then I can clean up the inside corners of the dovetails. I do that with this little thin chisel. With the cleanup on the drawer sides complete, I can now transfer my layout to my drawer front. And just like I did with the dovetail on the table, I drilled out the waste at the drill press and then I started cleaning it up at the bench with chisels. Once I had the majority of the waste chopped out, I can then pare along the sides to establish the width of the pin socket. And now all that's left is to clean up those inside corners. I'll do that by paring in from the sides and then chopping down along the back. Next I can start working on the drawer backs. I cut these pins first, so I'll lay out the pins first on the drawer back, and then I can start sawing them out. Once I've defined the sides of the pins with the dovetail saw, I'll come back with the coping saw and saw out the waste between the pins. After I clean up the pins, I can transfer my layout to my drawer sides. That's really simple when you're doing a drawer like this, and this is why I like to do pins first, is you can stick that drawer back in between the two sides, and you have a little basically a little clamping jig to hold that drawer back in place while you transfer the lines. Now before I begin sawing the drawer sides, I'll just transfer my layout lines across the end grain, and I can start sawing the tails. Once that joint is fit, I can work on the drawer bottom. I'm doing that real quick with a hand plane, just beveling 3 sides so they slide into the groove in the drawer itself. As first attempt here is a little thick on the left side, so I'll hit that again with the hand plane just to thin it up a little bit more and try to fit again. So that's still a little tight, so I'll go back to the hand plane a little more just to remove a little bit more material and then try it again. And that's the fit I'm going for, nice and snug. Now the next thing I'll do is install my drawer stops. These are just some scrap pieces of wood that are thin enough to slide under the drawer bottom. That I'm just using some CA glue to glue into the case. With the drawer stops in place, I can slide the drawer in until it stops, and then I can transfer the curved front of the table to the drawer. At the bandsaw, I'll cut out the curve on the drawer front. And then I use my sander to sand that drawer flush to the opening. I also noticed that the drawer fronts weren't looking that great after being sanded, so I also went over those with my card scraper. And now I can attach the top. I'm using my dividers again to get the top in exactly the same position as it was when I scribed it. And I can transfer the layout holes from my screws. Now here's the scariest part of the whole project, drilling into the top. Make sure you're drilling into the underside, and make sure you're not drilling all the way through. Let's see, I actually stopped to double check to make sure my stop gives me plenty of room before it actually goes through the table. And using one of these little offset screwdriver thingies, I'll install the screws and attach the top to the table. It's crazy how fast time flies. I built this table. I finished it in July of 2014. It was a wedding present for our friends Mel and Kevin, and it's been really fun being able to see this thing every time we're here as it's transferred through all their homes and as their family has grown. This has been a centerpiece of their home. A happy upcoming 10-year anniversary to them. If you want to build your own table like this, I do have a full set of plans available. I'll leave you a link to if you'd like to check those out. Otherwise, thank you as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments on the coffee table or anything back on my old shop, please feel free to leave me a comment. As always, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, happy woodworking.